Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This week we studied a portion of Vayeitzei, and we're starting from selections from Likutei Sichos, the third the third talk of the Rebbe. Just a short background. Yaakov was summoned by his mother and father, last week's Torah portion, and is asked to travel to the family, to Rivka's brother, and find a wife for himself. Because they don't want him, Rivka refuses to accept that he should marry a Canaanite, a local girl. This week begins with Vayeitzei. Yaakov exited his hometown, his land, his country, and his journey to Haran. A miracle happens, and it took him just a couple of hours, and he lands on Mount Moriah, the mount where God will be building the Holy Temple soon. And he goes to sleep, and he has a dream. In the dream, he sees a ladder, and angels are going up and coming down. He wakes up, and he says, how awesome this place. And he turned to God, and he makes a vow. Our discussion would be the vow that he makes with God. What does he say to God? He takes that stone. There was a bunch of stones. There is a differences of opinions how many rocks he put around his head to protect himself. Some say 12, some say 4, some say 2, but there was more than one. And now it all became one stone, one large rock. And he says, this rock will be an altar to God when I return, and I will bring sacrifices for God's sake and that's the vow where he asks God for something, and in return, he will reciprocate, so to say, by dedicating himself to God by bringing a sacrifice. So here is the verses from the text, and this is, there is a very simple question that the answer is very simple, but the Rebbe wants to take it to a different direction. Our Torah reading states, Yaakov took a vow, saying, if God will be with me and protect me on this way, and give me bread to eat and garments to wear, and if I return to my father's house, then God will be my Lord, and this stone I have erected as a monument will be the house of God. And everything you will give me, I will certainly tithe. So he tells God like that, make my journey safe, allow me to return back to my father's house healthy and successful, and then this stone will turn into an altar. I'll bring sacrifices. God will be my Lord, and everything I earn, I will give a tithe. I will dedicate and give it to God for God's sake. The commentaries question, how is it possible that Yaakov made this performance of good deeds? This stone will be the house of God, and everything you will give me, I will certainly tithe, dependent on God's fulfillment of a condition. If God will be with me and protect me, he makes a vow that he will give tithe, that he will bring sacrifices, and God will be my Lord. It's all predicated on what? On God providing them with bread and garments and success to return back home. How do you make conditions with God? The implications appears, heaven forbid, as if Yaakov served God solely for the sake of receiving a reward. It sounded like he is asking for something in return, and only then he's going to have God my Lord, only then give tithe, only then make this stone erected as an altar for God's sake, and bring sacrifices. How is it possible for Yaakov, one of the forefathers, a leg in the chariot of God, to serve God only when God blesses them and gives them all that he's asking? That is implausible. After all, we are speaking about Yaakov, our patriarch. Hence, it can be derived from the narrative. Says the Rebbe, the answer is, from the narrative, it can be derived that by connecting his vow and good deeds with a condition, Yaakov was not making a deal, that is, vowing to perform these good deeds so that his stipulation be met, Rather, he had the opposite intent. His objective was to fulfill his vow. He made his vow dependent on the conditions, if God will be with me, etc., because this was the only way he would be able to fulfill it. In other words, he's not making it it's not predicated on the condition, but quite the opposite. He makes a vow, God will be my Lord, and I will make this stone as an altar for God, and I will give tithe. But he says to God, you have to provide with me with the means to be able to do that. How can I bring tithe if you don't bless me with wealth? How can I make this as an altar for God if you do not allow me to return safely back to my family? And therefore, it was not a condition in the vow, but rather it is needed objects or goods to be to be provided by God, so he can fulfill his vow. So far, so good.
Yeah.
The Rebbe says the Rebbe wants to take it to a deeper level. A deeper understanding can be reached by prefacing two interpretations of the vow taken by Yaakov. I'm just going to, instead of reading, I'm going to summarize the point that the Rabbi is making. There is something called, there are two commentators who disagree about one part of the vow. In the vow, there is one part, it says like that, and God will give me bread and garments, and this stone will become an altar for God, and I'll give tithe. But in between it says, and God will be my Lord. The question is, will God be my Lord part of the condition or part of the vow? One way of looking at it is, God will be my Lord is my vow. I will make God my Lord. In other words, that's my promise for God. Give me bread, give me food, give me clothing, give me to return me safe. I will accept you as my Lord. That's one way. In other words, the vow is part of the God be my Lord is part of the vow. That's Rashi. Ramban, Nachmanides disagree. Nachmanides says that this is part of the condition, not the vow. Nachmanides says he is asking God to be my Lord, and asking God to give me bread, and asking God to bring me garments, and asking God to return me back to home. And then he will fulfill by bringing a sacrifice and tithe and bringing tithe. That's the core, this says the Rebbe, of the debate between Rashi and Nachmanides. God will be my Lord, even though it is placed as part of the condition. According to Nachmanides, it belongs to the second section. According to Rashi, there are two verses. One verse is reading about what he needs, the conditions.
Right.
And the second verse is about the vow.
Right.
That part, God will be my Lord, is part of the condition. It's written in the verse as part of the condition. Rashi takes it in the simple way. Therefore, he's asking God to be my Lord, meaning God should show me that he's protecting me and taking care of me. Ramban, Nachmanides says, no, it's not part of the condition, it's part of the vow. And he says, because God is my vow, I will do whatever else is. So whether it's part of the condition or it's part of the vow. Is this clear? Huh? Very good. This is a very complex part of the talk. According to Rashi, yeah. According to Rashi, it's part of the condition. In other words, God should be my Lord, and then I will do such and such. According to Nachmanides, it's part of the vow. If God did such and such, God will be my Lord. Okay? The Rebbe takes it even though the simple text, this is part of the condition and not part of the vow. Ramban, Nachmanides moves it to the second half of the vow, not of the condition. Says the Rebbe, Here is the Rebbe's explanation. We are on page 379. To offer a solution, Yaakov's descent, living Beersheba and Eretz Israel, and going to the diaspora, and particularly to Haran, a place whose name is associated with arousing God's anger in the world, was a descent for the purpose of an ascent. Anybody heard that concept in Hasidic? It's called Yeridat Tzorech Aliyah, a descent for the purpose of ascending. In other words, he's going down to a lower place where he belongs for the purpose of retrieving something great that will elevate him. The ascent comprises 3 dimensions. In other words, the purpose of going down to Haran, the worst part of the universe at the time, is for the purpose of ascending back and receiving something, bringing some treasures out. Though he endured living in Haran, and specifically in Laban's home, he nevertheless emerged unmarred by sin, without being affected by his surrounding environment. This enabled Yaakov to ascend to a higher level than is wrong before his descent. Whenever you have challenges and tests, and you stand against them and able to overcome them, you are reaching a much higher, greater level. And the Rebbe says it's like the difference between a tzaddik and a Baal Teshuvah. Who is greater, a tzaddik or a penitent or someone who repented? The Baal Teshuvah. Why? Because the tzaddik never stood against challenges. We're not sure what will happen if he faced that challenge.
Try to explain this.
However, if a Baal Teshuvah, he is returning from sin, from the way that was inappropriate, and still he connects to God, his bond with God is a far greater, much deeper. And therefore, when Yaakov lived in his home, next to his father and mother, it was natural for him to behave. But only when he goes to Haran, the place that arouses God's anger in the world, and he lives with the worst human being at the time, Laban, and he's able to stick with God and not deviate in an iota from God, now his connection to God elevated him to a much greater level. So that's number 1, the reason of going down to Haran. B, page 380. In Haran, Yaakov carried out the command, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it, as well as his father's instructions, take a wife from there, and may the Almighty make you fruitful in the in a consummate manner, to the extent that his bed progeny was perfect. Only in Haran, in the worst part of the universe, he is able to get married, as his father asked him, father and mother, and also create a family. That family, we know, did not deviate from Torah, continue on the same tradition, as opposed to his father and grandfather. They lived in the Holy Land. They had children in the Holy Land. It wasn't completely perfect success. But Yaakov goes to the worst part of the universe, yet he's able to create a very large family, and the entire family follows his footstep. In other words, that's the second descent for the sake of an ascent. Only in Haran he's able to succeed in creating the perfect family. Had he lived in Israel, he wouldn't be so successful. See, so we have 2. One is the level of Baal Teshuvah. Anytime he serves God amidst worst type of people, he serves God from a much deeper level of his heart, and therefore the reward or the elevation of his soul goes much higher. Second, creating a complete, large, perfect family only amidst the worst part of the universe, which would not be able to achieve outside of that town. See, to use a terminology of Hasidut, through his labor with Laban's sheep over the course of 20 years, he refined and elevated the sparks of holiness that were invested in Laban's sheep. This service generated a spiritual echo, elevating Yaakov to a greater heights, to the extent that the man became prodigiously successful. Says the Rebbe, there was another dimension to Yaakov's descent to Haran, which is becoming extremely wealthy. For 20 years, he is a shepherd. No one in the history of Torah was such a dedicated shepherd as Yaakov. Moshe was a shepherd. David was a shepherd. Abraham was a shepherd. Yitzchak, we hope, I don't know, I'm not so sure. But perhaps he was a shepherd. The children of Yaakov, except Yosef and Binyamin, perhaps, were shepherds. Every one of our fathers were shepherds. No one, the Torah testifies about his faithful and dedication to the job like Yaakov. Yaakov himself said he was up at night, up by day. At night there was freeze. By day was very, very cold air. But regardless, he always watched the sheep faithfully and provided protection for them. Yaakov, by doing so for 20 long years, serving his father-in-law, was able to elevate the sparks, so to say. It's a Hasidic terminology from Kabbalah, taking the good that exists within those animals and bringing them back to God. In other words, his connection to godliness and serving his purpose in the universe can only be achieved in Haran by serving his father-in-law as a shepherd for 20 years. So again, we have in summary three concepts for which Yaakov descended to Haran. We call it Yeridat Tzorech Aliyah. He descended to elevate and reach a much greater height. Number one, he was in the level of a Baal Teshuvah. Despite all the challenges, he was stuck with God. He did not deviate from his service of God. Number two, that's the only place he was able to create a perfect family that will all follow his footsteps. And fulfill his father's demand that he get married. And number three, he was a shepherd for 20 years in which he elevated the sparks, bringing him back to God, thus serving God and elevating his soul to a much greater height. Now, says the Rebbe, that the action of the patriarchs, 381, the action of the patriarchs are a sign for their descendants. Everything we read, it's not a book of history. The Torah is a book of lessons that teaches us how to conduct ourselves. So when you read the story of Yaakov, it's because it's something about my life. As such, Yaakov's departure from Beersheba and journey to Haran are reflected in the divine service of every person. As Or HaChaim explains, this journey alludes to the descent of the soul to this material plane, as well as the descent of the Jews into exile. These two are descents for the sake of ascents and contain parallels to the three aspects of the ascent experienced by Yaakov. Says the Rebbe, just like Yaakov has received or retrieved three aspects by living with Haran, it is a reflection about my life living in exile, my life as Jewish people descending to the universe, Neshama going to the universe. It's like Yaakov going to Haran. The Neshama, or the Jewish people living in exile, surrounded by the non-Jews, also for the purpose of ascent, to elevate sparks and to connect to God to a greater height. Here are the three that as the Rebbe is going to say. A, as the soul exited the spiritual, as the soul existed in the spiritual realms before its descent to the material plane, its rang was comparable to that of a tzaddik. Through carrying out its divine service with the Torah and its mitzvot, after its descent to this plane and its enclosement in the body and the animal soul that conceal godliness, the soul reaches a rang comparable to that of a Baal Teshuvah, as reflected by the verse, the spirit will return to God who endowed it. In other words, says the Rebbe, when I go down, my neshama goes down to my body in this exile state of life, in this human physical body, it's comparable to Yaakov going to Haran, because by serving God in this material world, we are faced with great challenges which the neshama never had before, and therefore, anytime we serve God, it's like a Baal Teshuvah, someone who faces great challenges and still is stuck with God. B, through its descent to the material plane, The soul fulfill God's command, be fruitful and multiply, and also the Torah and the mitzvot as a whole. Says the Rebbe, be multiply and fruitful is not necessarily physical descendants, it's also Torah and mitzvot that we study. Every time I do a mitzvah, every time I impact somebody else to do a mitzvah, I become fruitful and multiply. I multiply by influencing others. If I tell someone, come to Minyan, and they did come to Minyan, I multiply because that person's good deeds is credited also to me. And therefore, says the Rebbe, only in this universe the neshama can be multiplied and fruitful. Up in heaven, the neshama cannot convince somebody to come to Minyan because there is no mitzvah to fulfill. The neshama cannot come to study Torah because there is nobody to study Torah. Only in this world, a man, a woman, a neshama can be multiplied and fruitful in a spiritual sense where they are able to expand godliness in the universe. So just like Yaakov, only when he went to Haran, he was able to create a family that will follow his footsteps. See, through its divine service with physical entities and the material plane, the soul makes the world into a dwelling for God, a dwelling in the lower realms. This accomplishment elevates the soul to a much higher rung than the one on which it previously existed. Says the Rebbe, what happens when I serve God in this universe? I keep kosher, or I make a blessing before I eat or drink, and I keep Shabbat, and I keep all the commandments that God gave us. I'm creating a dwelling place for God. You cannot create a dwelling place up in heaven. Then the angels cannot do it. Neshama cannot do it. Same as Yaakov being a shepherd for 20 years. What he did was elevating those sparks. When we live in this physical universe, we're elevating those sparks and making God's felt in this universe. And the Rebbe goes on to say about the third point, a comparison between these developments, that this world in its lowly state becomes a dwelling for God, and the ascent the soul achieves through bringing about this transformation points to an advantage from one standpoint of the divine service of carrying out all your actions for the sake of heaven and knowing God in all your ways over the divine service of studying the Torah and observing the mitzvot. Says the Rebbe, and the Rebbe goes on to say that Yaakov, I'm going to give you a short summary. Yaakov, when he went to Haran, he didn't go there to the yeshiva or to synagogue to make a minyan. He became a shepherd. You know what a shepherd is? Taking care of the sheep. It's all about day-to-day life activities. There is a benefit, a much greater achievements when someone serves God in their day-to-day life activities. Going to the factory, going to the plant, going to the office, doing work is far greater reaching out and serving God than someone studying Torah and prayer. And that's what the Rabbi is going to say to us. To explain that advantage, when a person's divine service encompasses even his personal matters, and he carries out such activities, your actions and your ways, for the sake of heaven, and in a matter through which he knows God, he enables God's dwelling to encompass even the lowest dimension of the worldly existence. And you have heard it from me many, many times. He is able to bring God to a much lower plane of this universe. If he studies Torah, it's still a holy part of the universe. If he prays to God, it's still a holy part of the universe. But what if he goes to work and he's a shepherd and he takes care of sheep and he does it for God's sake? So he can create a family, so he can support his wife and children, so he can show an example not to cheat and lie and not to steal by allowing his animals to graze on someone else's property. What he does then, in all your ways we call it, he serves God with material objects that are much farther than study the Torah or prayer, and therefore he brings down God to a much lower plane. Says the Rebbe, we can say that there is a benefit. I'm giving you a summary, and the Rebbe goes on in greater details. Says the Rebbe, that there is something else in the neshama of a Jew, a neshama, the soul, when you serve God in the day-to-day life, being a diamond dealer, being a merchant, being a banker, being a teacher. It doesn't matter what. Why? Because when you do a mitzvah, which part of you is involved in the mitzvah? The godly soul. The animal soul is asleep, is not there. The animal soul is totally gone. It goes away. But when I go to work, and I am a teacher at school, in public school, I go to work and I drive a Uber, I go to work and I sell fruits, what happens is my animal soul is involved because my animal soul wants to provide. My animal soul wants me to make a living. My animal soul wants me to have a big fat bank account. Therefore, the animal soul is involved in those mundane activities as opposed to the activities of Torah and mitzvot. When I'm at synagogue, the animal soul is asleep. When I study Torah, there is no animal soul. Therefore, says the Rebbe, by serving God in the food stand, by serving God as an Uber driver, by serving God in my business, day-to-day life affairs, I am including also the animal soul. Therefore, I'm bringing God lower. I also elevate sparks, which no other way I can elevate. By studying Torah, you do not reach the sparks of the animal soul. Only when you study Torah. That's the idea of Yaakov going to Haran and only there being a shepherd. He could have been a shepherd in Israel. But that means that the animal soul, the lowest realm of the universe, was not being caught. He wasn't able to catch those sparks. By going to the worst place and yet being honest and not willing to follow and learn from the misbehaving ways of his father-in-law, that's when he's taking also the animals and elevating. Yes, Roger, you had a question?
Just saying, is it because the light that you emanate from doing the mitzvahs in a dark place, the light will shine brighter in a dark place,
Right.
rather than if you're in a holy place, the light won't shine as bright.
Okay, you're making a good point, but the rabbi is talking about not doing even a mitzvah, just doing it for God's sake. In other words, he does not do a mitzvah per se. He's just going to work. He's just eating breakfast. He's just socializing. You can't call it a mitzvah. It's not part of 613 commandments.
Right.
But he does it for the sake of God. He does it because God wants him to provide for his family. He does it because God said, take good care of your body. In that aspect, from a Kabbalah point of view, he reaches much deeper than if he did a mitzvah. Your analogy works if he was involved in a mitzvah, and then you have a mitzvah in the Holy Land versus a mitzvah in Haran. Here, he's a shepherd. There's no mitzvah to be a shepherd. But yet, because he was a shepherd, not grazing in someone else's property, and all the shepherds are stealing and hurting each other, he does not. He serves as an example. Then he serves God in his ways, in his meaning a human personal ways, and that's far deeper and elevates much greater sparks than the mitzvah, because the animal soul is involved.
But
You understand?
the fact that he is conducting himself in a holy way actually elevates.
Right. The point is even greater than a mitzvah, even greater than a prayer, because then the animal soul is not involved. But in their mundane activities, the animal soul is part of it, and he's elevating the animal soul. That's the first point. Then here, um, He says, I gave you only one dimension. The Rebbe goes in through three different dimensions of serving God in the darkness of Haran, meaning going out of a realm of the godly soul into the animal soul realm and elevating sparks. Based on that, says the Rebbe, we can understand the differences between Rashi and Ramban about God will be my Lord, whether it's part of the condition, I want God to be my Lord, or it's part of the vow that I will make God my Lord as part of the vow. Says the Rebbe. Let's try and read it, page 395. Based on all the above concepts, it is possible to understand the 4 points mentioned originally in the verses described by Yaakov's vow. There are two facets of the condition. Yaakov postulated, A, if God will be with me and protect me and give me food to eat and garments to wear, and also B, that's according to Rashi, if I return in peace to my father's home, as explained above. The fact that they are divided into two verses indicates that they are of two different natures. Similarly, there are two aspects of Yaakov's vow, as understood by Ramban. God will be my Lord, and the stone that I have erected as a mountain will be a house for God. These two are divided into two verses. As mentioned above, Yaakov's ultimate intent was to fulfill his vow. The condition that he postulated were merely means that would enable him to carry out his vow. As explained above, the ultimate purpose of the ascent of the soul to this material plane is two-dimensional. A, to enable the soul to ascend, and B, to bring about a dwelling for God in the lower realms. Similarly, the divine service that leads to the accomplishment of these purposes is twofold. A, serving God through carrying out the Torah and its mitzvot, and also serving Him by carrying out all one's action for the sake of heaven. A parallel exists between the two conditions Yaakov established and the two general categories of divine service performed by the Jewish people. So you serve God in two tracks. One is serving God in the Torah and mitzvot. God said keep Shabbat. God said keep kosher. God said thank God Birkat Hamazon after you eat. And another way of serving God is in all my ways, meaning when I go to work, no matter where I'm involved, I do it for God's sake. And then I'm involved also the animal soul. Says Rabbi, this is what Yaakov is talking about. If God will be with me, protect me, and give me food to eat and garments to wear, conveys the potential from above for men to serve God through the observance of Torah and mitzvot, which are alluded to by the terms food and garments, respectively. Turning away from evil, guarding himself from sin, alluding to Yaakov's words, protect me and doing good. The condition, if I return in peace to my father's home, relates to serving God in one's personal matters, which, as explained above, is comparable to teshuvah. Indeed, Veshavti, I'll return, and I'll return is the same, share the same letters as teshuvah. The word Veshavti, I'll return, is teshuvah, to return. True. So says the Rebbe, when he says, I return to God and God will be my Lord, he's talking about serving God for God's sake. The first part, where he's asking God for bread and garments and protection, is for the purpose of studying Torah and fulfilling the mitzvot. In this realm, it's all about spirituality, the godly soul only. The second part, that's why there are two verses. The second God, he says, and I will return in peace to my home, and God will be my Lord. And then he continues, I'll give tithes. And God will be my Lord. It means that he'll bring God into the universe, even to mundane activities that there is no mitzvah, where he does business in honesty, where he's a shepherd for 20 years out in the field. but he does it for God's sake because God created man to toil, and only then he'll earn a living in honesty and create a family. In other words, that's a second, much deeper level of serving of God, where the animal soul is also involved. That's why it's a separate part where God will be my Lord, referring to bringing God into the physical universe, to Haran. So, says the Rebbe, these two, carrying out these two categories of divine service alluded to in the condition Yaakov stipulated, leads to the realization of the 2 points alluded to in Yaakov's vow, which reflects in the intent and purpose of the descent of the soul to this material plane. A, this is God will be my Lord. This refers to the ascent of the person, that is his soul, will experience. And B, this stone will be a house of God, the establishment of a dwelling in the lower realms. What the rabbi is saying is, whether this is the purpose of the soul, what's the purpose of the soul? To serve God with Torah and mitzvot, or to bring God into the mundane activities? Rashi took the simple text, both, but which one is more important? Rashi says, God will be my Lord is part of the stipulation. In other words, he says, I want God to be my Lord, and this way I can serve God properly. I can study Torah and pray to God. Nachmanides goes the other way. Nachmanides says that this is part of man's toil, man's service of God. And therefore he says, I will make God my Lord if you give me such and such. So it's part of the vow, not part of the stipulation, because according to Nachmanides, the service of God is expressed in a far greater, deeper level in the mundane activities as a shepherd rather than studying Torah and praying to God. Thus, we can understand the difference, the words, God will be my Lord. According to one explanation, it's part of the stipulation. I want God to be my Lord, to enable me to study Torah, to enable me to pray God. The second opinion is, I will make God my Lord, meaning I'll take God to the lowest realm of this universe, even when God, animal soul exists, and make it my Lord, make everyone see how I conduct myself because I am a servant of God. And that's, with this, we can conclude. Now we have a better, deeper understanding in the vow that Yaakov made. Yaakov came down to the Holy Land for 3 reasons. One is to serve God as a Baal Teshuvah. 2, to create a family. 3, for the purpose of elevating the spark of the sheep, that he was a shepherd. And when he turns to God and make a vow, it wasn't predicated on the condition, but he's asking God to provide the means to serve God. And therefore, he's asking God for all his need. And as we see, Rashi and Ramban disagree about God will be my Lord, whether it's part of the vow or it's a stipulation, because we can explain that as a reflection in our day-to-day life, whether this is the most important part of our life or the study of Torah and mitzvot is the most important part of life. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.